The Primarch Angron is one of the coolest centerpiece models in all of Warhammer 40,000 and a quintessential unit for many World Eater armies. However, he is also a problematic unit in competitive games of 40k. Today, we're going to workshop some ideas for how we can fix the angriest character in the 41st millennium. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Red Path. My name is Dara and today I'll be talking about some of the ways Angron's rules could be altered to create a fairer, more balanced data sheet while still retaining a lot of his interesting abilities. Angron is considered to be one of the most powerful units in the World Eaters Index, functioning as a cruise missile which can cause devastating amounts of damage to the enemy. He's incredibly fast, capable of moving up to 22 inches before charging, and is quite durable too, with 16 wounds, toughness 11, and a 2-up 4-up. He shows up in the vast majority of competitive World Eater lists, and it's hard to leave home without him when he offers so many things our army otherwise struggles to provide. He is the answer to dealing with heavily armoured vehicles or monsters, and provides powerful auras for the rest of the World Eaters army, making him an S-tier choice for competitively minded generals. Most people would agree that if you choose to play without Angron, you are opting to play at a disadvantage, and while it's great that our Primarch is such a viable choice, it can warp army design and balance around him, which is problematic. However, it isn't his base stats or his auras which push Angron into that problematic territory. His resurrection mechanic is arguably one of the strongest abilities in the game, returning him to the battlefield on full wounds and essentially providing your army with an extra 400-point unit. It is this ability which polarizes so many of the opinions around World Eaters and the main talking point for today's video. What makes it problematic isn't so much the fact that he does come back to life, but rather the uncertainty around this revival. As you probably know, resurrecting Angron requires the World Eaters player to roll a 666 on the Blessings of Khorne dice, which is roughly 13.5% likely to happen. Of course, we do have ways of manipulating this roll, but it's fair to say that his resurrection is always an unlikely outcome. This makes it very difficult to play with and against Angron. You're never really sure where you stand with him, and it can be difficult for an opponent to structure a game plan around an unlikely but not insignificant event. Over the course of the edition, I've spoken with many World Eater players at tournaments, and so many of them cite Angron's resurrection, or lack of, as the reason why they won or lost their games. Ultimately, this creates what we call a feels bad mechanic, a rule which feels pretty rubbish when it doesn't work or super powerful when it does. Of course, when he does come back, it can be a massive feels bad moment for your opponent, meaning either outcome creates a bad play experience for one of the two players. Games Workshop have come a long way in removing these type of interactions, and I am beginning to suspect that at some point we will see a significant overhauling of his rule. I'm sure World Eater players would mostly agree that they would like to see it changed, but since resurrection is a core aspect of his persona, very few would want to see it completely removed. So I sat down to think about how I would like to change this rule, and reached out to our Competitive Patreon Discord channel to discuss their ideas. I've pooled the best of these together in this video, and I think we've got some really interesting alternatives. I'd love if Games Workshop decided to implement one of these as his new mechanic, but I'd also be very interested to hear if you have a suggestion which is different from what we have here, so make sure you let me know down below or hop into our Discord to chat about it. So without further ado, let's discuss some of the suggestions from our Patreons. We're going to kick off this discussion with a suggestion from C. Baker M, which I really love and harkens back to the 9th edition and the Blood Tithe. I've dubbed this one Blood for the Primarch. This alternative for resurrection mechanic is as follows. After Angron has died, for every unit that is destroyed, friend and foe, you can add 1 dice to the Blessings of Khorne roll. All of these dice can then be used when attempting to resurrect Angron. Once Angron has resurrected, you return to the normal 8 blessings dice and he cannot be resurrected again. I absolutely love this suggestion, as it adds a ton of flavour to the rule while reducing the variability of the resurrection without fundamentally rewriting it. It does add an element of bookkeeping, but it's similar to the Blood Tithe, so it won't feel too strange for veteran players. It also pushes the World Eaters player to play more aggressively to ensure that they can maximise the likelihood of respawning the Primarch, but it comes at an interesting cost. At what points do you sacrifice mission play and victory points to chase down otherwise unimportant enemy units? Do you want to put out units of your own to be sacrificed in order to improve your odds? There's so much depth and play around this change, and I reckon it might be one of the most popular alternatives that I'll suggest. Seabaker also notes that Angron would have to go up in points to account for the improved odds, and I think that's a facet of any change which improves his likelihood of resurrection. If a Primarch is more likely to be active across multiple lives, he should be pointed appropriately. Currently, his points are strange because it feels like you don't get value out of him if he never returns. So I think by improving his odds and upping his points, we come to a nice place where he will feel good and reliable. If I was going to change anything about this suggestion, I would maybe revisit how the extra blood dice are used. It could be interesting to introduce a system where once a bonus dice is rolled, it cannot be used on subsequent rolls if Angron doesn't respawn. This would further introduce risk-reward management, causing the World Eaters player to have to consider if they're willing to gamble with 1 or 2 extra dice or wait until they stack up more favorably. In summary though, I'm a big fan of this alternative, which introduces a new type of agency for the World Eaters player and giving a certain amount of control over the chances of returning the Primarch to the table. Next up, we have a suggestion from GamesFan, which I've dubbed Unstoppable Doom. It reads as follows. The first time Angron dies, roll a single d6. On a 2+, Angron is returned to the battlefield and placed in reserves. He may enter from reserves 2 turns after this roll. As an example, if he dies in round 1, he returns in round 3. This is very simple and effective, while still introducing some limits on how Angron operates. As Games points out, it would be more similar to other resurrection mechanics in the game, such as the one Guilliman has, and would remove a large amount of variance for Angron. It also allows both you and your opponent to plan for his return, as you have a full turn or 2 to play around the fact that you know he will be coming back. This gives a decent amount of agency to both players, and would also make for some heated, aggressive rounds and really interesting plays for both sides. As Games also says, in the lore, Angron revives after a set amount of time, so it does help to translate this idea to the table. I do think that making a single dice roll to determine his respawn is extremely sweaty, but it's a lot more certain than his current mechanic, and a lot of other patrons have suggested similar 2+ revive rules, so it seems to be something that people are in agreement with. I do think such a rule would probably mean he would need to increase in points, and it's probably a good idea to limit it to once per game too. Personally, I enjoy the simplicity of this rule, but it's probably not my favorite alternative. Though it's not necessary, I think it does lack some of the complexity I would like to see tied to such rules, but that said, I do think it is much better than his current iteration. For the last of the Patreon suggestions, I've gone with a slightly more complicated iteration from Iron Dan, which I call the Skullpiler. This fundamentally rewrites the rules around Angron's resurrection, changing to a fixed number which has to be achieved instead of a 666. Any amount of the blessing dice can be added together to achieve this number at the cost of other abilities. Dan has also mentioned a plus or minus to this based on the current battle round. Additionally, Dan has suggested that for every unit Angron has killed in previous turns, he can add towards achieving that number for resurrection. Overall, I think this mechanic, while very cool, is probably too complicated and open to exploitation. Firstly, setting a suitable number is challenging, as the wide array of variables would very much influence what a balanced number would be. I'm not sure what I'd like this to be myself, but definitely something greater than 20. It does reduce the variability of Angron's resurrection, though maybe not by as much as the other suggestions so far, and it also introduces a certain amount of bookkeeping and every Warhammer player's worst nightmare, basic edition. I think it's probably the least likely of the 3 suggestions to actually manifest into reality, though I do like the overall theme, as Angron's own trophies contribute to his worthiness of actual resurrection, which is super neat. Once again, big thanks to our Patreons for supplying some cool and unique ideas here. I think they brought a lot of good changes to the table, and why don't you all vote in the comments over which one was your favorite? Of course, if you want to be part of the discussion, you can sign up to our Patreon and gain access to a competitively focused channel in our Discord and have your say there too. But to round this one out, let's move on to what I would do to change Angron's rules. Okay, so I've thought long and hard about what I would want Angron's resurrection mechanic to change for it to be a fairer, more balanced experience for both players. My logic for this is that while I wanted some amount of certainty to his resurrection, I wanted a suitable cost as well, one which isn't reflected in the points of the unit, so I came up with something called a blood price. The way this works is as follows. At the beginning of the battle round, before you make your Blessings of Khorne roll, if Angron has been destroyed in the previous battle round, you can choose to discard 3 of your Blessings of Khorne dice. These dice are removed from the Blessing of Khorne roll and all Blessing of Khorne rolls in subsequent turns. If you choose to do this, Angron is returned to the battlefield and placed in reserve. The ability is fairly simple, but resurrecting Angron comes at a steep cost. You can bring the Primarch back, but it will affect your Blessings rolls for the rest of the game. This will make those higher roll blessings harder to achieve, and can even create situations where you may not get any blessing at all. It has a knock-on effect of punishing Angron deaths early in the game, which I think is a good thing. It will force people to play more cleverly with Angron and not use him as a throwaway piece, despite the surety of bringing him back. It means that, should the World Leader player choose, Angron is certain to return, which means both players can factor that into their game plan, reducing the amount of feels bad moments on both sides, while still having a negative to the effect for the World Leaders. After all, nobody thinks it should come without a price or a risk. Now, I have elaborated on this a little bit more after some discussion with my practice partners, and we settled on some extra bits to add in. Namely, we thought that with the certainty of Angron coming back, it would be fairer if he didn't return on full wounds, but also introduce a mechanic where this could be manipulated. We decided that Angron should come back on 8 wounds, but for every unit which was destroyed before he returned, you could add 1 to these wounds, to a max of 16. This is similar to some of the other suggestions in that it pushes the World Leaders player into a more aggressive stance to maximize the ability, while coming at the risk of overextending. It takes away some of the power of Angron, returning on full wounds, but adds an element of control and decision making which isn't otherwise there. And personally, I think it's really fun and drives the narrative of the Berserkers desperately seeking to collect worthy offerings or give up their lives to herald the return of the Primarch. One thing we also haven't ironed out fully is the timing of the resurrection, and when those kill points should be accrued. I think it's a little bit too strong to have it open-ended, and you can choose to discard the dice in any battle round after Angron returns, since you could wait until the game hit the midpoint and spring him in then, when you need the dice a little bit less than in those opening turns. Or potentially just drop him in turn 5 where they rarely matter, so he can land on a point and score a lot of victory points. Instead, I think it would be better if the choice had to be made in the immediate battle round after he died, and that if you choose not to res him then, he's gone for the game. It would alter how the kill tally mechanic would work, so I think it could be changed to something like, for every unit destroyed in the turn during which Angron was destroyed, you gain that many wounds back for him. It makes it a little harder to admin, but provides a more balanced interaction, in my opinion. I'm sure there's loopholes that I'm not seeing, but personally that would be my preference for a new rule around the resurrection, and I'm very curious to see what you think about my suggestion, but let's start wrapping things up with a little summary. To close it out, I think we managed to pitch a bunch of interesting ideas here for rewriting Angron and making him a more balanced data sheet. All of these suggestions reduce the unpredictable nature of his resurrection mechanic while offering up some interesting costs and considerations. We all agree that, should any of these be implemented, Angron should certainly go up in points, and it's probably fair to limit these abilities to once per game. But it would change him into a much easier unit to balance and play around, probably improving the overall experience for the World Leaders General and their opponent. One thing I'm very curious about is if people who don't play World Leaders agree with any of these changes. So if you're not a World Leaders player and have made it this far, let me know what you think below, or share it with your friends and see what they say. While it has been a little bit more speculative than the videos we normally do, I think it's a good idea to have a discussion around these somewhat unhealthy mechanics and come up with ideas to improve them. Who knows, if it gets enough traction, maybe GW will see it and make the change. I've already sent my own suggestion to their FAQ, and if you have a good idea for this or anything else in the game, I encourage you to have your voice heard and drop them a polite email. If you've enjoyed this video, you can show us some support by liking and subscribing. We're almost at 6k subs now, which is a great milestone, so let's get over that line. All the links to our Patreon and Discord are down below, so if you want to explore more from the Red Path, dive in there. For now though, I've been Dara, you've been watching the Red Path, and until the next one, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.